You know, winter doesn't have to be all about shoveling snow and slipping on ice. Today we're going to paint a beautiful winter landscape that is so simple it'll leave you wondering why you haven't done this before, while at the same time avoiding the cold outside. So go grab your watercolor supplies and some hot cocoa and let's get started. All right, now really quickly before we get into the painting part of this, let me go over the simple little outline sketch that I have here on my paper. Now you could probably even paint this in more of a free-handed way if you wanted to. There's really not a ton of stuff going on here, which is partly what makes this painting on the easier side of things. I've drawn it pretty light on my watercolor paper though, so let me pull out a darker version of it here, drawn with a thin Sharpie marker instead, so it's a little bit easier to see. In fact, I'm going to touch this exact same drawing up a little bit better and put it on my Etsy shop too if you'd rather just skip right to the fun of painting and not have to worry about drawing your own. The first thing we need to place in here and figure out is the general area of the fence line. As far as composition goes, it's really best to put this at a slight angle to make it look a little bit more interesting. And we also need to be careful not to have it run across the very center of the page. Mine is below the center mark of the page. In fact, I could probably divide the paper up into about thirds here, and the fence line is around the bottom 1/3 of the page with approximately 2/3 above. This move and placement will make the picture more aesthetically pleasing to the eye rather than having the picture directly cut in half. Now, as far as the fence goes, it's really nothing too fancy. In fact, for those of you that feel like you don't have a super steady hand, this painting is going to be perfect for you to try out. We have a lot of squiggles and uneven lines in this piece, which really just adds to the charm. I recommend starting with 2 larger foundational posts first, then you can draw the long cross beams stretching out between these posts. I have 2 in here, the top and the middle area. I have also added in another little line in here that will represent the snow along the top part of the cross beams, but that is an optional step. After I get the long cross beams drawn in here, then I can add some smaller stick or twig-like posts as well to sort of finish off the look of the fence. These are, again, not very straight at all. They're rough and rustic looking, like they were just branches cut out from a nearby tree or something. To help put this into perspective, you can also try to have the posts on the left side maybe a little bit thicker and longer, and then as you move to the right side of the page, slowly make them more thin and shorter. Now that the fence is drawn, we can add in a bit of ground at the base, starting with just a rough bumpy line, kind of like there's snow piling up right here. And then along that ground line, we can also add in a bunch of thin grass lines near some of these posts. To kind of change things up a bit, I do have less of the grass lines near the middle area of the page and more at the ends. Let's finish off the groundwork here by adding just a few small details in the snow. Here I've drawn just some squiggly shapes that could maybe represent some rocks or piles of snow on the ground. I'm choosing to only have this on the left side where things are larger and maybe closer to the eye's view, but you really can add this wherever you want and as many as you want. Then along the ground I have a few small markings indicating maybe some ups or downs, shadows or highlights within the snow. I've put in a couple of lines for where maybe some shadows might be cast from the fence post as well. Nothing too crazy. In fact, you probably don't even need to add in this step if you don't want to. And for the last thing on our picture, we just need to add the wintry, leafless tree in the distant background. It may be a good idea to establish a line for the base area first and then work your way up from here. I thought it best to draw in the main larger trunks of the tree first and then add in all the little branches and twigs spreading off from that. I will say you do have the freedom here to do whatever you want. You can have as many branches as you want. Maybe you don't want very many in yours. In fact, you can also add in more trees if you want to. This painting could also look good in a horizontal format instead of vertical like I'm doing today. You would just need to make your fence line a little longer. You really do have the freedom to do whatever you want here. You're only limited by your imagination. All right, once as you've either drawn or traced this little outline onto your watercolor paper, we are ready to get to painting. I've got my paints in a paper towel, some clean water, and I am going to recommend taping your paper down with some artist tape as well. We're going to be putting a lot of water and wet paint on this piece, and this is really going to help with some inevitable warping of the paper. Then of course we need some brushes. I'll be using my personally designed Craftimo brushes today. Maybe I'll pull out the large number 10 round for the background wash since it is going to be a pretty large area. Then for the detail work, I'll pull out the number 3 round and the number 1 rigger. These brushes are currently out of stock, but they will be back again very soon. So I have a link in the description of the video if you'd like to click on that so you can be one of the first ones notified when they're back in stock. And the last supply that we need for today is a little bit of masking fluid. Usually masking fluid can sort of be an optional step depending on what we're painting, but I really do recommend it for today's painting if you have it. We will be using it to mask off some of the snow here to keep it nice and white, and then we can paint the entire background over the whole page without having to worry about trying to go around it. Now, along with the masking fluid, I always pull out an old brush to use so that I don't risk ruining or gumming up one of my nicer, more expensive brushes. But if you rub a little bit of liquid soap in the bristles, it really can protect the brush and help clean that fluid out later. All right, while we have this fluid out and ready, let's go ahead and apply this on first thing. And as a side note, all of the supplies you'll see me using today will be listed in the description of this video, including a link to my Etsy shop if you'd like to look into anything further. Now, like I said, we'll be using this fluid to just mask off a couple of these small areas where we want some nice bright white snow to be. I'll place it on the tops of the fence, both along the cross beams as well as the tops of the larger posts. I'll also add a little bit of masking fluid down here with the snow blobs or rocks, whatever you want them to be. In fact, I'll probably add even some extra areas of fluid here that I didn't actually draw on. Just some small spots along the bottom area of the fence around the blobs that I've already drawn. Okay, now we do need that fluid to dry completely before we can paint over the top of it. But while we wait, let's go ahead and wash out the brush that we just used, and then we can start getting some of the background colors ready on our tray. For the sky area, I kind of want to do a very light sunset. I think I'll try a warm orange first, mostly cadmium orange with maybe just a hint of alizarin crimson mixed in there. Next, we'll pull out a little bit of pure Gamboge and then some pure alizarin crimson. Now, these are not going to be super bright or overwhelming colors. I'm going to keep them pretty watered down and light in value so they won't totally overpower the soft snow down below. Now, for some of the shadows within the snow, we'll pull out a little bit of ultramarine blue, again, keeping it very light in value. I think my masking fluid is pretty much dry now, so I'll go ahead and move on, but you will want to make sure yours is dry first too. We'll be painting on this background color using the wet on wet technique to help the colors mix and blend easily. It also just helps keep everything nice and wet for a longer amount of time so you can play with pushing that color around without it drying out too quickly. After the entire paper is wet and shiny with a layer of water, we can start adding in the color. My plan is to have the color start out really nice and light, and then as we move down the page, it will get a little brighter. I'll start with some of this orange first, just moving the brush back and forth. In fact, I'm really not even worrying about the color being even or smooth. I'm purposefully leaving some streaks or lighter areas or darker areas to give the hint of maybe some soft, subtle clouds in the sky. Now that I've gone down a little ways with the orange, I might even just throw a touch of this yellow Gamboge in here to mix in as well. Then down a little farther, let's try adding a little bit more of a concentrated orange with maybe just some touches of alizarin crimson too. This is all pretty light in value so far, but I do want the bottom half to get a little brighter and darker in value, especially in the open space that's off to the right side of the tree. I picture this being sort of the area where the sun is actually directly setting from, so there's going to be more color here. Just keep playing around with it and adding in and blending in some colors until you feel like your painting looks good. With my tutorials, I really try to break down what may initially look like a complex painting into simple step-by-step instructions, hopefully making painting feel accessible and achievable for anyone, regardless of skill level. I myself am more comfortable painting florals. I'm not as comfortable with landscapes, but this is a great landscape to paint if you're in the same boat as me. It does take some time, but it's really not too difficult to do. If you find you're enjoying my painting and teaching style, I hope you'll consider subscribing if you haven't already so you don't miss out on any of my new and upcoming tutorials. I think that sky looks pretty good. Before we move on to the blue color within the snow though, let's take a touch of this same light orange color and place it in a few areas down here at the bottom part of the picture where the snow is going to be. Now it might seem a little bit weird right now, but this is going to create a really neat effect later on. This not only creates a little bit of highlight areas within the snow, but it's reflecting some of that sky color in here, making it look a little bit more realistic and tying the picture together as a whole rather than having a complete separation of color, the top half being orange and the bottom half being blue. Again, I'm just using a fairly light value of color. All right, now that we've got all the orange colors in here, we can begin adding in the blue. Now, a few things to keep in mind. You may have noticed that in my original drawing, I didn't actually draw in a horizon line, and I did that on purpose so that the sky and the ground almost just quietly and carefully fade into each other. So this is the moment that you can decide where that sky and ground separation begins to appear. I am once again keeping the color very light in value. However, I may make it slightly darker on the left side of the page and fade it out more towards the right. I'm also leaving a few areas of white space in here and there, and we do want to be careful to go around the orange highlights that we just painted so the entire ground isn't just blue. This is supposed to represent white snow after all. There is one more thing that you do really need to be careful with. If you know much about color mixing, then you're aware that blue and orange are complementary colors. When complementary colors are mixed together, it can create a brown. So we really need to tread cautiously in these areas where the blue and the orange are potentially touching. You really need to not overwork the space or blend the colors too far into each other, or you're going to end up with brown snow and a brown sky base. So this is important to be cautious with. Because the blue is acting as a shadow color, I am going to paint some lines of blue in here, spreading out from the base of some of these fence posts too. All right, this is a pretty good background wash for this painting. And the crazy part is that it really fills out a good majority of the piece. So the only thing that's left to do is add in the details. Now, of course, we need to let the paper dry completely before we can move on, but I'm feeling a bit impatient at the moment. So I'm going to pull out my trusty hairdryer and speed up this drawing process a little bit. You may notice that my paper also looks pretty warped after all of that water and paint. A lot of people like to stretch their paper in advance to help with this. To be honest, I don't usually take the time to do that, but you can do whatever works for you. But I have found that this sped up drying process, as well as the hot air from the hairdryer, does tend to help flatten out that paper pretty good again. So that's what I'm going to do today. Okay, moving on. Let's start adding in some of the details. I'd like to emphasize the shadow area down here along the bottoms of these little snow blobs down on the left side of the page. So I'm going to pull out my number 3 round and a little bit of burnt umber and then spread that color around here just a little bit. Now, I must have accidentally bumped my camera because after all of this was recorded, I went back to look at the footage and realized this filmed crooked. So I apologize for that. It kind of bothers me, but oh well, it is what it is, I guess. All right, continuing on, let's add in the grasses around the base of the fence line next. I'll probably do some different colors in here, but for the majority of the grass, I am going to just use some raw sienna and the number 1 rigger so that I can get some nice thin lines. One of the best parts about this painting is that a steady hand is not required. In fact, the more squiggles we get in here, the more rustic and natural looking it will be. So go ahead and make these grass lines a little bit squiggly if you want. It's just going to add some character. After I've painted in the main grass lines using this color all along the fence line, I may just take a small amount of water and rub at the base of the grass so that it'll sort of soften up any hard edges. We want to give the appearance of it being buried or poking out from the snow, so softening up the bottom area can really help achieve that effect. Next up, I might throw in a few lighter colored grass lines using some Gamboge mixed in the area where I had that orange color. This is going to make a nice golden color. This is just going to give a little bit of highlight into the grass, making it look like it's got some sun still shining on it slightly. I'm kind of focusing this color more around the tops of the grasses on the right side of the painting, but I will add a few throughout the rest of the fence line as well. Now to finish off the grass area here, all we need to do is add in a little bit of dark shadow color. I'll use some of the burnt umber that's already here on my tray and start adding that in, mostly focusing this color along the base area of the grasses. Now you can pull it upward a little bit too if you like, but this is meant to be more of an accent color, so try not to overdo it. Okay, this painting is really starting to come to life here. Hopefully it hasn't been too difficult so far. The good news is that the next step is probably the easiest of the entire painting. We are going to paint in that background tree next. This is a pretty simple thing to do. Let's switch over back to the number 3 round brush again and darken up the burnt umber color that's on our tray by mixing in a good amount of ivory black. I mean, it's pretty much just going to be black with a hint of brown to it. Then all we have to do is paint in the tree. Now, because it is in the background and a distant feature, we are just going to paint this entire thing one solid color. We're not going to worry about any highlights or value changes. We're just painting in the tree. Simple and easy, especially if you drew some sort of outline to follow at the beginning. Now, to start this tree off, I'm just painting in the larger main trunks of the trees first. And in fact, you might see that I've decided not to paint the very bottoms of the trees all the way down quite yet. I'll save that and do that in just a little bit so that I can softly blend that color into the snow. Again, the good part here is that there's no need to have a steady hand. Some little bumps and imperfections actually are going to add to this part. Okay, now that I have kind of the main larger trunks done, let's go ahead and paint the base of them. I'm going to add a little bit of color here, but then after that color is on and still wet, I'll rinse and dry my brush off and use that damp brush to gently spread or soften the color out to each side and along the bottom to give the appearance of it being embedded in the snow. Let's go ahead and finish this tree off now by switching back once again to the #1 rigger brush and finish painting in the smaller, thinner, squiggly branch and twig lines on the tree. Now you can have as many or as few as you'd like here. Just use your artistic eye to make the decision as to what your painting needs. All right, well done. Now, I know that tree might seem a little bit dark for the rest of this picture right now, but I promise that this is all going to tie in together nicely in the end. So let's go ahead and move on to finishing off the fence now. I'll switch back to the #3 round again really quickly and start this by painting in the 2 larger posts first. Now, if you like, you can just paint this a solid dark brown, keep it simple and easy, but if you want to go the extra mile and add a little bit of shading, let's take a little bit of lighter raw sienna color and paint that on the right side of the post. Then, while that paint is still wet, we'll take some of the darker burnt umber and paint it on the left side of the post, and then let those two colors sort of blend in the middle where they touch. Now, this is just going to add a bit of highlight on here that I personally really like, and it also changes it up a bit from being that really dark color that we already have on the tree. In fact, I like this two-toned effect so much I'm actually going to go ahead and paint all of the other smaller posts in the same way. It will just be a little bit more tricky here because the lines are going to be more thin. All right, great job. Let's go ahead and finish off this fence by taking some of the dark burnt umber and now painting it across the cross beams. Now, I'm not actually going to worry about doing that two-toned effect on these cross beams because I do have the masking fluid on here that we're about to take off, and that is going to help with that extra dimension instead. So go ahead and just paint these really quickly. Nothing too tricky or complicated. A little bit of squiggle look is absolutely okay. Then when everything is totally dry, you can go ahead and take off the masking fluid on the fence as well as on the ground. Now you could probably leave these areas just a bright white, but it does look a little bit harsh to me. So I'm just going to soften this space up just a little bit and make them look more natural by watering down some of this ultramarine blue color that's already on our tray. Then I'll use some of that light watery blue and paint that color just right at the base of these white areas. Now let's soften up the white area or the snow on the fence as well. I'll still use some of the same light blue, but because we're kind of putting this color alongside this really dark brown, there's a good chance that some of that brown is going to start bleeding into this light watery blue. Now, I actually don't mind that look too much. It just kind of ties everything together. But if you're starting to get too much brown mixed in here, more than you want, rinse your brush off periodically so that you can continue on with more of that pure blue color in the next section. And that is it. Wasn't this such a fun and simple landscape to paint? The contrast between the really soft, light colors with the dark browns really looks striking. And the oranges from the sunset sky just warm up the whole painting so that it doesn't make you feel cold when you look at it. I really like this piece, and I hope you do too. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you had some fun and maybe even learned something new. If you did enjoy this tutorial, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel so I can continue to help you discover your artistic side.